So let's start with domain 5, guys. Domain 5 is related to the cloud security operations. This was replaced in, I think, 2019. Previously, this domain was called only cloud operations, and now it is called cloud security operations. And this is kind of a turning point for your exam scoring. This is a very important domain which has a lot of topics which we have already covered, but now those will be more relevant from the security operations perspective. So we will again touch base on the data center design. We will again touch base on how the physical infrastructure is managed and protected in the physical environment. Okay. Then how the logical infrastructure for cloud environment is managed. What are the compliance and regulation controls? We will discuss that. Then what are the risk assessment? So this we will focus more from the security operations perspective. So again, let us quickly touch base on what are the factors which will affect the data center design, the physical design of a data center. So it should be the location. So where you want to build your data center, which has to provide the cloud services, like, is it properly covered under legal and the regulatory norms of any country where you want to form it? What are your availability of resources from a contingency perspective? Like, do you have the redundancy of power? Do you have the redundancy of network? What are the compliance requirements from a location perspective? What standards you are going to follow when you are designing the data center, like, ISO 27001? Are you going to follow the ITIL processes? And then what is going to be your physical design from an environmental surrounding perspective? Okay, so this also will have specific requirements on your hardware security, like, how you are physically going to secure your servers, switches, your network termination points, your power points, your ACs. Then when from a physical thing, when you move on the logical design of the data center, then the first point which comes into the picture is that how you are protecting the VPCs, that is virtual private cloud. Okay, because that is the key for your cloud segregation from a virtualization perspective. So that is how are you going to secure your VPC? Then how are you going to secure your security groups? I hope that a majority of you are aware what is security group from a cloud terminology perspective. In cloud, the firewall is called security group. So how are you actually securing the security group is also important. Then how are you securing the host? Because host security is something which is the responsibility of a cloud service provider, which is your physical hardware, and then how you are securing the different OSs. So different operating systems which are running on the host is also a part of your logical design. Now, why it is important? Because of the basic characteristic of cloud, which is multi-tenancy. As that is a native feature of any cloud, the VPC protection, security group protection becomes very important. Okay, so we come to the most important part of the cloud management is cloud management plane, which is used for your configuration management, which is used for utilization of different services, like, you use to create different services, like you create your server hardware, you create EC2 instances, you attach storage to that, you create your network, you create your different security rules. Okay, then it also helps you to have your SLAs configured. It also helps you to have your logging, monitoring, and auditing. It is also important that you have your security factors defined for the virtualization technology. So how are you going to secure your APIs? How are you going to secure the communication between the users and the management plane, that is a customer and a management plane? How are you going to secure the storages, like the encryption which we have discussed, what encryption standards we are going to follow, what are the different key management techniques, where are we going to store the keys if customer opts for the storage of keys on the with the cloud service provider. So all these things will come under the security of virtualization technology, also along with the BCDR and the failover and replication. Okay. Other design considerations on logical and physical is how are you going to take care of separation of duties, both from the customer, the cloud service customer, and cloud service provider perspective. Okay, then who is going to monitor the network traffic to and fro on management plane? Okay, automation and use of API, which is mainly for provisioning of the services. Here we are not discussing the application APIs, but the APIs which are used from management plane to provision your different services. Then what are the different identity and access management solutions you are going to use, how you are going to have the federated identity between your on-prem and the cloud solution. And the most important part is SDN. So how are you going to use these factors also impacts your cloud security. Okay. So when we go on logical design level, as we have discussed in last module also, that control plane plays a very important role, because it is the plane where you are connecting your management plane to the actual layer of different hardware used in the data center, and that provides the capability to each cloud service provider to provide services like infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or a software as a service. Okay, so it's very important that each cloud service provider takes necessary steps to secure his environment, to give that assurance to the customers. And for that, as we have discussed in previous slides, there are various certifications which are available from the cloud service provider perspective, as you cannot go and physically audit any environment of a cloud service provider. Let's move to the next point. So let's again touch base on the physical design of a data center. So when you are designing the physical data center, okay, it should also consider the environmental factors when you are designing, which we have discussed. Like, if you are designing a data center and you have not checked on the earthquake prone zone or a flood prone zone, then you are going to land in trouble. Okay, you also, as a cloud service provider, you also need to consider that, okay, what are the good options? Is it built from a scratch or by a ready-made infrastructure which is available for a data center? That is another option. Okay, now when we are considering about data center, a while ago I explained that there is something called Uptime Institute, which provides the certification for a data center based on its services it can offer to the customer. Normally, when we are discussing from a cloud service provider perspective, it is giving certifications on 4 tiers. Like tier one is a basic data center, which has just a single site and the infrastructure with the basic services. Tier two is having a redundant site infrastructure capacity, like it has got a redundant power supply, it has got a redundant AC units, and it has got other, like the internet service and all as a redundant. Then on a tier three, which many of data centers fall into this category, is concurrently maintainable site infrastructure. So it is mainly for the banking organizations fall under this category, where even if they are having their own data centers, they have to fall in tier three, where your power supplies have to be redundant. They also need to have the UPS backup, which also need to have a generator backup. Your internet need to be redundant. Your switches, your servers, everything need to be having a redundancy. Okay, and the tier 4, which is a highest tier, which mainly is suitable for the healthcare services, is a fault tolerant, which means zero downtime. So whatever factor we are considering has to have the redundancy. It's a highest tier. So it's like, when specific question comes, that means on a tier 4, even your network connectivity or a power supply also need to come from multiple vendors. You cannot have two internet line or two power supply lines coming from the same person. It is not called the fault tolerance. Okay, and on the data center, in last domain also we discussed that if you are having a data center which is on-prem or the cloud service provider, the norm is to maintain a temperature between 18 to 27 degrees, which is the norm for temperature, with a moisture factor of 40% to 60%. This seems very simple, but this is a definite exam question. Many times, like in my CISSP and CCSP, in both exams, I have got a question on this temperature and the moisture factor. So there is a definite exam question on this. Also, there are certain factors which we will cover again in detail in upcoming slide, but which you need to know is the use of KVM, which is, I believe that many of you must be knowing what is it is KVM, which is keyboard, video, and mouse. Now, why this is important? Because in any data center or a cloud data center's perspective, you having a remote access, or you having access to insert any external say USB or a hard disk, which will cause a huge risk from a security standpoint. So the simple way is that you give, if you have to access any physical device for a maintenance purpose, also use the KVM or use the RDP sessions. Okay, so it's very important from understanding perspective. Okay, and when you are using any standard data center, it is very important to have a physical separation of the servers. Okay, so now we get into something called secure configuration of hardware, which is related to the actual settings of hardware depending on the OS and the virtualization. So what are the best practices? Okay, when you want to implement the server environment, so you have to have a secure build, and you have to have a secure configuration. So if we go on any cloud environment, you will see that if you select any operating system, like you select that you want to install, say, Windows 19 server, or you want to install Linux, or you want to install Ubuntu, you are asked for a specific version, and then there is an image available which you can roll. Now, if you are using infrastructure as a service, you can build your own images and you can use it for your future, because then it will help you to have a standardization. What is the benefit of standardization? It will help you for your secure patch management, which we are going to cover in upcoming slides. So that is where when you are having a data center tier, you need to have your host hardening, you need to have a safe patching, you need to block the non-root access to the users, you need to make sure that all the connections are secured, maybe using the TLS or SSH. We are using the host-based firewall. There is a role or a rule-based access control, and the secure patch management on virtual environment or a physical environment. It is very important from the physical security operations perspective on any data center. But currently we are discussing cloud, so it is very important from a cloud operations perspective. Okay. Now, the second part after server is the storage. So what are the best practices you have on the storage? So you use the ISCSI hard disks. You have a fiber channel over Ethernet so that your connectivity is secured. You have the dedicated network. If you are using any ISCSI standards on cloud, then you need to consider that, okay, if you are implementing a private network, then if the traffic is sent unencrypted, your private tunnel has to be secured. You have to use the encryption using IPsec, or you have to use the VPN. The required authentication standards have to be used, like Kerberos, or the secured remote passwords, or the simple key protection mechanisms. Okay. Now, in this, also note that if you are using a physical switch, okay, if the cable goes down, the switch will be down. So the security from that standpoint is also important. And if you are using a virtual switch, if any cable is obstructed, your entire switch can go down. Okay, so it's very important to have a network isolation, physical security from the network stack perspective. And here, even on a cloud, you can implement the intrusion detection system, intrusion prevention system. Okay, which will help from the traffic perspective. It will not help you from a VM threats. Okay, so we come to a very important point, which is isolation and configuration of virtualization and protection of management planes. So how you will protect? The first point, which is very important, is isolation. So from isolation, it means that your root password should always be protected and secured from the normal users. It should not be shared. You should have a continuous monitoring of your management plane. You should run frequent vulnerability tests for your management planes, and you should have a logging and monitoring enabled for management plane. And to secure the management plane, you should have your defense in depth. That means you should also enable the multi-factor authentication. You should have a required access control, or maybe a machine control defined for that. These are the controls which you can implement for securing your physical environment in cloud. Okay, so you should take care of the legal requirements. From a cloud perspective, we have discussed it multiple times. The main legal requirement is to protect the multi-tenancy environment of cloud. Okay, you have to take care of compatibility from the cloud services perspective, that whatever services are required from different organizations or different customers, the cloud should be able to provide the compatibility for the same. Okay, then the controls, so who handles the key management from encryption perspective, logging and monitoring of the data for all customers. If any customer is having the payment card data stored, then the PCI DSS access, different upgrades and changes, so proper change management or ITIL processes, different regulations if you're covered from health authority or health laws if you are using the PCI DSS. So why we use KVM in any data center, which is like a cloud or any even a private data center also, is it isolates the data channel. It also have a protection from the tampering. Okay, it also prevents the intrusion from any external factors. It has got a fixed firmware. Okay, it is safe from the design. It has selective USB permissions, so any breach possibilities are taken care of when you use the KVM. Okay, because access restriction on a VM console is very important. You cannot have open access to the VM environment. So normally in any on-premise or cloud data center, the use of KVM is of utmost important, and this is a definite exam question. Because in old days, when I was managing the on-prem data center, the KVM switches were very common when we had a physical physical hardware. It started fading off when we went more on a virtual and RDP came into the picture. But even if the RDP you are using from an end user perspective, but if any person who is managing the physical hardware, when that service come into the picture, KVM has to be there. It's very important to note. Okay, and that is where, again, from a cloud perspective, it is important that you isolate your management plane, because that's the only interface which is having a possibility of single point failure if it is not secured from an organization perspective. Because management plane goes down from your cloud service perspective, you are completely detached from your cloud environment. Okay, then when we are discussing about the network, you need to segregate your network using the virtualization of your LAN, and all network points should be audited. Again, the restriction on your network point should be maintained through the access control. Okay, so your VLANs also should be protected. You need to implement the transport layer security using the X509 certificates. You should have a strong encryption mechanism. You should, when you are defining the TLS, you should also make sure that your handshake protocols are defined. Okay, the next protection layer is of the DNS. So DNSSEC is another important factor from the security standpoint, because you are when you are hosting your services, whether on-prem or on cloud, DNS poisoning is a common phenomena, and if you want to protect, you should have a DNSSEC implemented. because it will when you are implementing DNS, it will have the threats like your footprinting, the denial of service attacks, data modification, redirection. Okay, so we come to the next point, which is what are the threats for the physical environment. Okay, so it brings us to the risk assessment. When you are having your physical environment, you need to have a proper asset management system. You need to have a proper baseline to implement the configuration management system, which I have discussed even from the platform as a service perspective. Because if you're providing platform as a service or even infrastructure as a service, you need to have your baseline image of your infra defined. Okay, you also need to have the consideration on automation technologies, which will automatically, like if we when we are discussing about AWS or Azure, and you say that okay, I want to roll out a EC2 instance with XYZ configuration, then the automation comes into the place, because when you select a say EC2 instance with two CPUs and 500 GB of a storage and a security group and IP address, and when you click on create, it the automation layer, which has the APIs which takes you to create your physical EC2 instance, which assigns the security group, which creates the IP addresses, which also attaches a storage to it. It all happens in the background, which is transparent to the user. So security layer for those automation technologies is also very important. Okay, then you also need to make sure that you have a robust change management system for any changes which you are doing on a physical layer of infrastructure, and the vendor specific guidelines. So it is an important point, guys. Please note that if on the physical layer, if a cloud service provider is using a specific brand of a hardware, for example, AWS is using say Nutanix server farm to provide the different virtual servers to the customer, and they want to do the patch management on Nutanix, then they have to follow the vendor guidelines to make sure that there are not any lapses in maintaining the or in implementing the patches on that particular hardware. Okay, it is very important, and I will again touch base on the vendor management thing. Okay, and when on a physical layer, when the infrastructure is getting implemented, it is also important that you use the clustered host. What is the importance of clustered host is because it makes sure that the redundancy is available. That helps. Clustered host helps on load balancing. So high availability is taken care of, and it also helps on baselining of any hardware or a software what you are implementing. Okay, if you want to understand this in detail, again I will recommend that please refer the CBK 4th edition of CISSP. It again has explained the patch management or a configuration management in quite detail, and it is self-explanatory. Okay, and when you are doing a patch management, there are certain things which you can automate, which are like what are the security patch. So you cannot make it automated, like the patches will be downloaded directly from the vendor. So there has to be a mechanism where all the patches are downloaded, they are inspected, they are tested, the changes are recorded, and they are approved through a proper channel. You are creating the versioning or a tracking records, and after testing and documentation, then you are implementing it into the live environment. Okay, because If this process is not followed, it will lead to the lack of standardization. It will lead to the multiple versions and maintenance of multiple collaboration tools. It will also lead to a poor or say it will lead to a failure of the patch execution if the testing is not done, and it will also lead to running of a virtual environment in a different versions and the zones. Okay, before I get into the patch management last point, I just remembered on this MSP versus cloud broker. One thing, guys, remember, I will prepare the one small difference tomorrow, but MSP is always for your personal hardware. So managed services are normally taken for your hardware which you own, and the cloud service broker helps you to design and negotiate your services, and maybe in an instance manage the services which you are going to take from any cloud service provider. Okay, please note that. So MSP, maybe you will get to mislead, but MSP is not a point which will be questioned on the cloud. Okay, so we were discussing on the patches. So please remember that the patch management has to be monitored in a secure way, and it helps you for your performance management on monitoring on network, on your disk, and your memory and CPU also. Okay, there are certain monitorings which maybe a cloud service provider can outsource, which is like your background check on HR, your SLA definition, and your certain trial services on your hardware that can be outsourced. Okay, on a physical thing, also note that implementation of network security control, which we have discussed from a defense in depth perspective, like a multi-factor authentication or a dual factor authentication is also to be noted. The firewall security of your host based firewalls, and then use of different tools from a cloud perspective to implement a layered security. The tools like the intrusion detection system, which can work as a passive tool to analyze the signature based or anomaly based malwares or the traffics, and helps you to protect your environment. So you have the network based intrusion detection system, you have the host based intrusion detection systems, and more proactive mode of that is of intrusion prevention system. So it can also help you to block the malicious traffic on the fly. So I believe that being from the technology background and preparing for CCSP, IDS and IPS is something which all of you must be already knowing. Okay. Another topic which we should also prepare from an exam perspective is the virtual machine introspection. So this helps you to, allow the agents for less retrieval and guest OS state. That is, running process, active network. Okay. So it is like, agentless retrieval of your state. And virtual machine introspection can do external monitoring for IDS and IPS. And it can also be used for malware analysis, for memory forensics, for your process monitoring, etc. Okay, so there is one important tip which you should remember from an exam perspective is that your logs should be preserved, classified, and protected as per the regulatory and legal requirements. So you cannot say that I have only 1 day log, or I have only few hours log. So log maintenance should be done as per the legal and regulatory requirements, and it should always be captured as per the NTP. Why NTP? Because it should have the uniform timing. You cannot have the logs captured on different time zones if your cloud-based architecture is in a different regions. Maybe one is in Ireland, one is in Mumbai. So NTP protocol is very important from a log capturing perspective. Okay, that brings us to the maintenance of the management plane. Okay, because management plane from a long run perspective also requires the regular maintenance, and it's an important topic. So when you are doing any maintenance from a cloud perspective, the service provider need to make sure that he is having the access for that particular service block, and alerts are disabled, but the logs are enabled. It is very important. It will have a definite exam question that when you are doing a maintenance, okay, what should be enabled and what should be disabled. It's a very important point, because when you are doing any maintenance, if you are disabling the logs, it is going to be difficult to find out that what went wrong in case any trails are required. So come what may, the logs should be enabled when the maintenance is going on. The alerts can be disabled. Vulnerability management is part of different processes what you follow. So if you have done a proper risk assessment, improper maintenance of management plane is a vulnerability. So how you will mitigate that is by doing a proper maintenance and orchestration of your management plane. So it's again a subjective topic. It is based on scenario to scenario. Okay. And cloud orchestration is another important point, because the goal of cloud orchestration is to automate the configuration, coordination, and management of software and its interaction. So this is also something which I explained, that when you are using your management plane to provision any specific services on cloud, like you want to have the new hardware environment or a new VPC created for your organization, and say you want to provision a couple of EC2 instances, attach storage, create a security group, create the IP addresses. The orchestration layer is something which is transparent to the cloud customer, but it works in the background to create the environment, whatever you are selecting through the management plane. Okay. So logical design, that's why is part of design phase in SDLC. And from a management plane perspective, it lacks the technology details, because it is completely abstracted for the user from a network and the hardware perspective. Okay. And when you are securing the network on cloud, we have discussed the technologies previously. I will again touch base on that. The technologies which should be used are VLAN, transport layer security, DNSSEC, and IPsec. Okay, so today VXLAN is something which is widely used on the cloud environment, which is virtual extensible LAN, which is added as a new topic in the CCSP syllabus, and it works on layer 2 and layer 3 of the OSI layer. Okay, so please make a note of it, which helps to protect the network configuration on the cloud. We also touch based on OS hardening. So I will again explain a few points on that. That OS hardening on cloud is done through the application baseline. So capturing a baseline which is very important for the bare minimum security requirement. Then baseline configuration by the platform. Then what are the different utilities which you use for Windows or maybe other operating systems to create a new baseline. Okay, and the important tool which is used in cloud is called SCAP, which is Security Content Automation Protocol. Through this you create the baseline images and they are executed on a need basis. These services are available through the management plane. Okay, so this brings to the further topics of how you control the remote access. So when you are having the logical infrastructure, so how do you manage that? Okay, so it is the remote access. How do you manage? How do you change the credentials? That is important topic which we have discussed from a federated identity perspective. That should be linked here. That how you will manage your access control. Okay, then how you use the cloud to reduce the attack surface. That is another important point. And there is definitely one exam question on this, that how the access is made through the cloud and ensure that the internal network is not exposed. So how the proxies are managed, how the SDNs are managed, then what are the various benefits of remote access, how it is secured, and how it prevents the exposure of credentials, how the accountability logs and monitoring is done. Okay, how the session control is managed, how it is preventing the the open session timing, like how you can define the idle session timing and how you can close the session on automated basis. The OS baseline compliance, which we have discussed on the patch management, that how you will define the baseline OSs, that what you use and how you will maintain the standardization on that. Okay, then how you will implement the security controls for the network. So the log capture and analysis of those logs, management plane for the SDN, what are the complexities from regulatory controls. These are the points which you should go through from the CBK in detail, because there are questions which are coming on the network security controls. Then what are different, the ITSM solutions which are available as a third party tool, like how you manage your portfolio, how you do your demand management from your cloud infrastructure perspective. Okay, so that brings us to implementation of various controls on cloud. So how do you do the security management on cloud? How do you do the configuration? So this we have discussed in brief, that how the change management is done. So that's where a lot of cloud service providers are following the ITIL standards, where the change advisory boards are there, the proper change approval processes are followed. Because if any change management is not handled properly, it will directly have an impact on your availability of the services. So it's very critical to do the change management in a proper way, which is also linked to your continuity management. So in a change management, how the requests for the change are received, how the review is done, how the approval is or a denial is done, and then how the testing and implementation of the changes is done, and how the versions are created. It's very important from the exam perspective. Then incident management, this we have discussed in the previous domain, but again, incident management is an important topic from exam perspective, that you should know that what is the difference between an event and incident. So what events can lead to an incident, how you identify that this is an incident, what kind of analysis is done, what are the actions taken to rectify, what are the corrective actions, and what are the corrective measures. These are different things. Then what is a problem management? Then there is a definite question on what are the differences in incident management and problem management. So the objective of problem management is to minimize the impact on the problems which lead to the incident. Okay, so please make sure that you understand this difference, because problem is something which is unknown, and it has definitely led to one or more incidents. So if you are doing a root cause analysis, you will find out the problem, then you will know what kind of corrective actions you can take to solve those problems or find out a workaround to permanently block those problems. Okay, then you also should have the process for release and deployment management. Here we are again discussing from a cloud service provider perspective that whatever deployments cloud service providers are doing, they should plan their deployments, they should have a schedule to deploy, and they should have a control on the releases, what they're doing. Okay, and all this planning is required because the cloud service provider have a service level agreement or a service level management to be done. Okay, we will discuss a few things on the digital forensic. It is very important because on cloud, you do not have a physical access to the environment. So in case of any incident which has taken place, you completely rely on cloud service provider to provide you the required logs or data or evidences. So the digital forensic is something very important from a cloud service perspective. Okay, so normally when you have an incident happening on an on-prem data center, you have access environment, so you can segregate, isolate or segregate the environment, and you can collect the respective logs and data. But in cloud, you have to have the clear SLA or a contract defined with the cloud service provider in case of any incident, how you will have the access to that data. Because your normal challenges are that you don't have a control over the data. There is a multi-tenancy in a cloud environment. Okay, finding out the chain of custody for your data is very difficult, and because of that, evidence management or evidence acquisition is difficult. Okay, so how you will have control over that is that you have to define all these scenarios in your service level agreement and your contract, because many incidents can be handled more efficiently and effectively if the forensic consideration has been incorporated into the system life cycle. Okay, so how you will define that? You will define that when the identification of incident is done, you want to collect the evidence, you have to approach the cloud service provider, you have to align on data collection, you have to make sure that the data is collected, examined, analyzed, and then presented to the respective bodies. When you are collecting the data, the proper labeling, recording of the source is very important. When you are examining the data, the process of collection and the analysis of that data is important. And when you do the analysis and examination of data, you can create your report and submit it to the respective bodies. So digital forensic is something which has got a major role play from a cloud service provider perspective. Okay. And chain of custody from a cloud perspective is that you must take care that when you are gathering the data or handling or transporting or analyzing the data, you are not damaging any logs or the origin of that data which cloud service provider has given to you. And that leads to an important point that you should have a proper policies and procedures defined for the evidence management. And please note from an exam perspective that do not collect unwanted evidence from the cloud service provider, because that will have too much of data for your analysis. Okay. Then shortly, we also need to discuss on when we are discussing the digital forensics, we again have to touch base on risk management from a cloud perspective. That even from a cloud service provider perspective, the risk assessment, that is framing of risk, assessing the risk, and having a proper risk framework is important. Even from a cloud service provider, having the qualitative and the quantitative risk assessment is important. So same terms what we have discussed in the disaster recovery, the single loss expectancy, the annual loss expectancy, RPO, RTO again will come into the picture. So please remember, if required, again go through the CBK for CISSP if you are missing something on that. Okay. Chain of custody from the digital forensics is very important, because it is something in case of incident you will have to prove to the investigating body. So how you have acquired the evidence, how you have preserved the evidence is important. Okay. So this brings us to the last point of this domain, which is on how you manage the communication with relevant parties. So how you manage your vendors. So what are the vendors of a cloud service provider? So any person who gives the internet connectivity, who gives the cooling systems or the physical hardwares is the vendor for them. How do they manage the customers? How do they manage their partners, regulators, stakeholders? Each part has to be studied in detail, because you should know that who is the target of communication, what is the communication designed to achieve, when is the communication best delivered, where is the communication pathway managed from, and why this communication is needed, and how the communication is getting transmitted. So it is called 5 Ws and 1 H principle for the effective management of communication. Okay, and it is applicable for all these relevant parties. So 5 Ws and 1 H. This is important from the exam perspective, because it's normally the questions are there that how do you manage your communication, and then they have different scenarios explained. Okay, so like if you are managing vendors, so how do you onboard a vendor? What are your criteria for vendor evaluation? Then after onboarding, what are your contracting terms? How do you manage them? And then if you are offboarding a vendor, what are your processes? Okay, so it's very important from the management perspective. And the last point, what we need to cover is the security operations. So how do you create a security operations center? So how the traffic is monitored, what kind of monitoring KPIs are defined, how do you have your firewalls, IDS and IPLs configured, what are your agreement terms you create for having a honeypots or assessments done on a cloud service provider's environment. because you need to take this vulnerability assessment reports from them. No cloud service provider will give you permission to do a penetration test or any vulnerability assessment on their environment. For that, you have to rely on their report or maybe a SOC 2 type 2 report to get a detailed analysis from them. Okay. One more time, I'm telling that the network security group is of utmost importance, which is the virtual firewalls in cloud environment, and the log capture and the auditing. So in this domain, the from the exam perspective, it is very important that you know the high level ITIL process, the difference between problem management and incident management, the difference between change management and patch management. How do you do the vendor management? How do we handle the digital forensics? What are the SLAs and contracts? How do we do the risk management? And of course, physical and logical design of a data center. Okay, so this brings us to the end of domain 5. Should we move to the question answers for the domain 5? The correct answer here is D. Why D? Because incident response, the major objective of any incident response is that you should be able to make sure that your business goals are achieved. So if your business requires a continuity, your incident response should be able to provide the business continuity. Okay. And please again note that here you have to think like a manager. You are not a doer. If you think as a doer, you will select B. So if you are a manager, your objective is to roll out to the normal state of the business requirement. Okay. Let's go to next question. Correct answer here is D. So this is what I was referring when we were discussing on the data center design. So if you are having any production environment which is providing services to the outsider, normally a organization follows the standard. Now, if somebody is having a raised floor of 18 inches, it might not have any like a irregularity or something like that, but the recommended size is this. So any cloud service provider who is constructing a data center, he will follow this standard because this is defined by the Uptime Institute. Okay, let's go to the next question. The correct answer for this question is D. So it is again related to the physical design of data center, and it's very important to maintain a required level of cooling as well as humidity, that the exhaust of racks face each other, and exhaust should never be on the front side of the rack facing the servers. It's a basic of a data center design. Let's go to the next question. Correct answer here is D, because native language of customers is not required to be considered when you are designing any data center. Next question. Correct answer here is D, because when you are focusing on architecture, your focus should be on automating the service enablement to avoid unwanted interference from, or to avoid unwanted manual interference. Next question. The right answer here is C, because that is the main function of software defined network, which helps you to segment the networks into the multiple segments for each customer. That's its main function. Next question. The correct answer here is A. Why A is because first you are using the service only for your archiving. Okay, you're not using it for any production or anything, and your main goal is to save the cost. So when you have that goal, you will go with a minimum configuration thing on any data center, and that is a minimum tier is tier 1. So that's why the correct option is option A. Okay, let's go to the next question. The correct answer here is C. Why C is because C, it is about when you are doing continuity operations during contingency. Okay, so that means your physical access to the data center is required. Your broadband connection is required. Access to the clean water is required from the CCU and the staff perspective, but the extended battery backup is immaterial because you will have your generator backup. So that's the odd choice left, and that is why the correct answer is C. Okay, let's go to the next question. This is a very simple question, and the correct answer here is D. So HVAC systems normally put the warm air out to the outside world. That's the way they are designed. Last question for this topic. The correct answer here is obviously A. That's the importance of encryption. Okay, so when you are moving the live merge virtual machines from one host to another, it's in the clear mode. That's the one of the risks of virtualized environment. Okay, so I hope you guys are clear on this domain, and tomorrow we'll have last domain, which is one of the smallest one from the exam perspective, having only 13% of the weightage on the legal risk and compliance. Okay, thank you very much.